Hello there, welcome to The Comments, the collaborative project by Espresso Global and Ukrainian media. I'm Olena Solodovnikova, and it's a great pleasure for me to be joined by the famous neurosurgeon and writer Henry Marsh. You are well informed in Ukrainian context, and probably 2 years ago you have told that Ukraine is the border between Western freedom and Russian slavery. This is absolutely great definition. But do you have a feelings, perception that we will continue to be perceived by the world as a buffer zone that can be destroyed to the ground?
I fear so, yes. I mean, it's very difficult to feel optimistic at the moment about the future of Ukraine. I know that Ukraine will remain free from Russia, or most of it will. It's hard to see the Eastern territories being won back at the moment. And obviously, a lot of this depends upon political developments in the EU and in America. If Trump wins in November, if Marine Le Pen wins in France, things could become very difficult. All I know from my many friends in Ukraine, I was just there 2 weeks ago, is that most Ukrainians see no alternative to continue to fight, however grim the future seems. So the war will go on. Obviously, terrible damage is being done to Ukraine. Reconstructing and rebuilding Ukraine will depend upon a lot of money from the rest of the world, on political goodwill. And at the moment, it is impossible to know what will happen. But at the same time, if Trump is defeated, if sensible people like Ursula von der Leyen in the EU remain in charge, then the future is not so bad. So nothing is lost yet, but there is a real feeling of being on the edge of a precipice. But do I remain optimistic? Yes, I remain optimistic, because we must remain optimistic. If we give in to fear, then surely bad things will happen.
Well, but you predicted also that the West comfort will be paid for with the blood of Ukraine. NATO will not intervene directly. You were absolutely right. And could you explain, is it exactly what is happening, why it is happening? Is it about the selfishness of big praise, why they don't help us by NATO, only by some small troops from France, for example?
Well, the answer is that this is determined by politics, by elections, and most people in Europe do not feel very strongly about what is happening in Ukraine. I think that's a mistake. But human beings are very good at going like that. Obviously, it's the countries like the Baltics and Poland, which have direct personal experience of just how terrible the Russians are, or the Russian leadership is. I wouldn't damn all Russians. Those countries understand completely why Ukraine is essential. Success in Ukraine against Russia is essential for Europe. But many people will vote for Le Pen, although Meloni in Italy, although she's horribly right-wing, she has been strong in supporting Ukraine. But populism is on the rise in Europe, without a doubt. This is all tied up with immigration and also the complex of economic difficulties and inequality. And populism appeals to stupidity, simple answers to things, and has no great, and also admires dictators. We know Trump admires Putin. Populism is about not thinking critically, and people like the idea of big, strong men. And as the American writer H.L. Mencken said once, for every difficult problem, there is an answer which is obvious, simple, and wrong. And that is what populism is about. It's about simplistic solutions to complicated problems.
But as for me, populism is very good works in countries where people are very low educated. But in the Europe,
Yes,
in the
yes.
USA, that is vice versa. Many people they want to thinking about something, not only about the.
Well, America, it's very complicated in America. There's quite a long history of populism going back 100 years. It's also tied up with the fact America is still, well, it's a born-again Christian country, a very simplistic outlook on life. Also American exceptionalism. They really are indoctrinated to think America's the greatest country in the world, which it isn't, just as Russia isn't. No country is the greatest country in the world. But nationalism and isolationism has deep historical roots. I mean, it was a close-run thing that Roosevelt was able to take America into the Second World War and save Europe from the Germans.
Yep, but back to the very not very strong support of Ukraine, and not enough weapon for us for still. What about the fear of Russians? Because as for me, Russia is working to exhaustion, hoping for the war fatigue. In your opinion, how successful in the strategy?
So far, not very successful. I mean, Europe, because it's, 26, I can't remember how many countries in the EU, decisions are very slow. And although they so far have usually made the right decisions, it's taken a very long time. In America, the problem was Republican Party politics and the domination of Trump. So it was local political factors which was having this terrible effect on starving Ukraine of weapons. I suppose perhaps also many people think, oh, we won the Cold War, Russia is no longer a global threat. And then the Russians have been very clever at publicity and rattling their nuclear rockets, which of course is rubbish. They know if there's a nuclear war, everybody is destroyed. But the Americans, we mustn't upset Putin. We mustn't escalate. It's what's so annoying, what is so distressing is that eventually they make the right decisions. Now, after 2 years, they accept that American missiles can be fired into Russia, at least near to Kharkiv. Many people have been arguing this for ages, just like F-16s, tanks, heavy. So it's this reluctance to get committed, but then being forced to do it eventually, because there is only one logical position to take, which is to give Ukraine everything it needs to defend it. The question of boots on the ground and Macron and NATO, I think, is more complicated. I mean, the Russians, I think Putin and his men are rational actors. They're not mad. They're imperialists. They're trying to recreate the Russian Tsarist Soviet empire. They want to be a big world power again. They're not suicidal. But we know from history that war can easily spin out of control. You think of the First World War, all these great empires, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the German Empire, all marched to war, and they're all destroyed. And so war is unpredictable and very dangerous. But the idea that at the moment there is a major risk to supporting Ukraine, I think it is nonsense. But in terms of NATO troops getting involved, I think that's a very difficult problem.
Yes, you're absolutely right about the Kharkiv. That is my native city, and I was very disappointed because only now the official West said, okay, we can hit Russian territory.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. it just means thousands of Ukrainians have been killed, millions of dollars worth of buildings have been destroyed, while the Americans and the Europeans sort of dither and, but that's the way it's been. And I think that's the way it will continue. At least from what I've read, the Russian Kharkiv offensive was ground to a halt. And we are seeing a whole new technology in warfare, particularly with drones, and the fact that mounting surprise attacks is almost impossible now because of drone surveillance. And historically, defense has always been easier to defend than to attack. But that seems to be even more the case now. Whether the F-16s, when they finally come, hopefully this summer, whether it will make a big difference or not, I don't know.
Yep. I wanted to talk a little bit about the historical concept and about the Britain that is the not saint country. Britain was able to give up its colonialism and imperialism. Why Russia failed to do that during the 30 last years and to return to the methods of invasion, domination, and try to back to the Soviet Union system?
Well, there's probably no simple answer, but one is the Russians have been much more ruthless in suppressing independence movements in the many parts of the old empire. Although the British were ruthless in the 19th century, and they were pretty ruthless in Kenya in the 20th century, on the whole, the British were reluctant to use, very extreme measures against independence movements. I mean, Gandhi and non-violent protest probably could only be successful because the British were not willing to shoot everybody and lock them all up. The Russians have been much more ruthless. And, well, one suspects the Russians are just less civilized. I'm not justifying the British Empire, but I mean, there's an arrogance and cruelty throughout Russian history, and also the contempt of the people at the top of the hierarchy in Russia for people at the bottom of the hierarchy in Russia is remarkable. If Putin dropped dead, which I'd be very happy if he did, I suspect it would not make a very big difference. But again, what goes on in the Kremlin is very hard to know. But I think Putin is as much a product of Russia, and particularly of the KGB, as the other way around. So I see him really as being, I think it's a Russian problem rather than just a Putin problem.
Yeah, but what is your focus about the back to the Soviet Union with Russia? Because now they try to use Georgia, the situation in Georgia.
Yes.
They try involved here too, and all country from this post-Soviet Union republic, they need to back it.
Well, I don't want to make too many comparisons with Nazi Germany, but what drove Hitler and the Nazis to success was this stab in the back treat with national humiliation. And there's no question of the fact that Russia, the Soviet Union, suffered a massive humiliation in the 1990s. I am skeptical as to whether a Marshall Plan for Russia, as some Americans have argued, would have made a big difference. But there is no question of the fact that Putin is appealing, there's this Russia, rightly or wrongly, the Soviet Union saw itself as a world power. In the 1990s, it fell completely flat. There was a lot of stupid triumphalism in the West from Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and people like that. There was lots of ill-advised economic advice from the West as well. And as far as I can see, Putin is playing on that, this sense of national grievance, hatred of the West, because it's ever since Peter the Great, I think Russia's had this ambivalent attitude to the West, sort of envy. The Russian oligarchs put all their money in banks in London, send all their children to be educated in schools in England, and yet are saying the West is rotten, land of homosexuals and nonsense like that. So this love-hate relationship is very deeply ingrained. Both the sort of superiority complex, Moscow is the third Rome, Mother Russia, magic Slavic soul, which is a sort of reaction to feeling rather inferior to the West, because historically they've always done rather badly, particularly economically. And of course, the Russian economy now is in a terrible state. I mean, the population is declining. All it's got are natural resources, admittedly a lot of them. So its demographic future is very, very uncertain. Add to that climate change. I mean, some people say Russia will gain from climate change, but that's in the future and uncertain. Whether it influences Kremlin thinking or not, I don't know.
Yeah, but the last question in this block, political, what do you think about the collapse of Russia at all?
I mean, it's Russian society is very tightly controlled. It goes back to the KGB, the NKVD, the Cheka, the Okhrona under the Tsars. It has a history of highly effective suppression of dissent. So I personally don't think there'll be another Russian revolution, but the future is always uncertain.
How do you see the Ukraine in 10 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was talking about this with my friends in Kiev 2 weeks ago. It is very worrying, but a growing gap will appear between the Ukrainian diaspora who've run away and the Ukrainians who stayed behind. I mean, my friends have all stayed behind, including with their young children. Now, sure, if you lived in Luhansk or Donetsk, it's different. But, if you think of North Korea and South Korea, East Germany and West Germany, countries can grow apart, populations can grow apart. And the first reaction to flee to Poland, to Europe, was understandable. But now, if I was Ukrainian and still in Ukraine, now I'd say, well, actually, what am I supposed to think about all these people who've run away? And it's not just mothers and children. So it's difficult, it's very worrying. But what is so extraordinary about the 32 years I've been visiting Ukraine is I've witnessed the growth of an educated young people who want Ukraine to be a modern civilized country with a civil society. And that has not changed. If anything, that has been strengthened by the war. And the extraordinary voluntary sector in Ukraine, the extraordinary strength of Ukrainian people to help each other, not to depend upon the state, is, I think, unique. I don't know anywhere else in the world like that. So I choose to see that as a cause of optimism for the future. Ukrainians have incredible strength, at least the ones who stayed, rather than the ones who buggered off. So, yeah, if anybody can make a success of the future in Ukraine, it's the Ukrainians. And I remain genuinely hopeful about that. But obviously, it still depends on the war, on politics in Europe, politics in America. Your future is not in your own hands.
I tried to ask you about all the medical reform of Ukrainian healthcare. And you know that we have a lot of corruption here. And when exactly did we make mistakes? Because I remember when the Western medical system was imposed to us, I remind about your books when you wrote about and criticized the medical system in Britain, some part of it. In short, what is fundamentally wrong with the Ukrainian healthcare system now?
Well, first of all, Ukraine, apart from the war, Ukraine is not a rich, not a wealthy country, and modern healthcare is very expensive. All countries in the world are struggling with rising healthcare costs. But I think if you ask me for one simple point, the problem is medical education. Technologically, in the big cities, you have modern hospitals and modern equipment, but the medical education, both at an undergraduate level for students and even worse at a postgraduate level, has not changed. You still basically have the old Soviet system, which was very poor, but also reflected the fact doctors had very little equipment. They couldn't do very much. So you didn't need to train them very much, because much of what they did was no different from homeopathy. But there is a real need to try to improve medical training and medical education, particularly at a postgraduate level, but that is very difficult. Many of the senior professors have a vested interest in keeping the present system as it is. You have to bribe your way to pass your exam, or you can bribe your way to pass your exams. You have to bribe your way into a department to get postgraduate training. So that makes changing it all very difficult. Whenever I go to Ukraine, I know some really good doctors. They're all neurosurgeons. They're both technically good and ethically good. But I also, every time I go, I will also see the most terrible mistakes being made, not because the doctors making the mistakes are bad, but just because they're so poorly trained and so ignorant, because they have not had a proper structured education in the way that I have had and most doctors in Europe, and all doctors in Europe and America have. But how you change the educational system in Ukraine is obviously very difficult. I'm a great fan of Ulyana Saplun. I think she was trying to do great things, but it was very difficult, and she did not last. But the training needs to be fundamentally improved.
And what is your opinion about the Ukrainian medicine phenomena when we have very good medical hospitals, when you can pay money and you got
Yes.
everything, but in another hand, you have a very, very poor situation in the
in the government hospital.
Government,
So
well, it still continue to be there, like that.
Well, I mean, it's a problem, believe it or not, in England as well. All government healthcare costs are struggling. In England, poor people have to wait a long, long time. When they get treatment, it's usually good treatment eventually, but there are long waiting lists. If you pay, then you can get everything done very quickly. This is a worldwide phenomenon, particularly bad in Ukraine, because Ukraine is a poor country fighting a war. People don't like paying taxes. If you look at Scandinavia, which is a wonderful example of how good things can be, even there are problems. So there are no easy answers to that. What alarms me is I've seen some very, very state-of-the-art brand new private hospitals in Ukraine, and the doctors there making the most terrible mistakes. It's one thing to have all the equipment, but you need to know how to use it properly. And that is horrifying. It's an old saying, no castle is stronger than the soldiers defending it. You can have the best built castle in the world, but if the soldiers are no good, it will fall.
Yeah, unfortunately. This is a very naive question, but why are Russians trying to hit our hospitals now? Is this about the genocide?
Well, I don't know, but certainly in Syria it was deliberate, I'm told. If you kill a doctor, you kill all the patients that doctor would have saved. So this is logical and rational and brutal. And that's the Russians for you. If you're fighting a war, you want to kill as many people as possible. By killing doctors, it's very effective. And it's pure terrorism, but it's kind of ruthless logic.
And what is your thoughts about the doctors from the occupied territory. I was here probably 9 years ago, and some people from Donbass region, they stay here working in hospitals and say, we continue to do our work. Do you support them or not?
Whereas I was asked if Putin came in as a patient under me, would I operate? You know, and the answer is yes, because if it's the doctor, you start saying, I don't like this person, I won't save them. It's what we call a slippery slope. So I think it's an important part of being a doctor. You try to save everybody's life, even if you hate them, you know.
But if
I mean, there was an English doctor saw Saddam Hussein years ago as a patient, and he advised him to stop smoking because he was a heavy smoker. And he said, during the invasion of Iraq, which of course was a ridiculous mistake, he said he rather regretted telling Saddam Hussein to stop smoking. No, as a doctor, you treat everybody. You don't, just as I assume the Ukrainian doctors treat wounded Russian soldiers if they arrive in hospital.
How do you explain the fact that people quickly get used to the news of death at all in Ukraine and all the world?
Yeah, I know. Well, that's human beings. We adapt. We adapt very quickly, and children adapt even more quickly than adults. It's why, you know, it's humans why we survive, because we accept it.
Of course, I wanted to talk about why you choose helping hospices and palliative sector in Ukraine.
Well, that's really, I had this, I'm very good friends with this famous English palliative care doctor, Rachel Clark. And before the pandemic and before the war, I'm always keen to bring other specialists to Ukraine to see if there's scope for helping. And I was pretty sure that palliative care in Ukraine would not be very good. So I had this plan to bring Rachel, who was very keen to come. But then because of the pandemic and then because of the war, it got delayed. But through contacts with my very good colleague, Dr. Andriy Mizak, who translated 2 of my books and is a neurosurgeon I've worked with for many years, he made many contacts with some palliative care doctors. And Rachel is very enthusiastic. She's been out twice. I'm hoping she'll come back to Ukraine with me in October. And she's made contacts with palliative care doctors. And there is great possibilities, not so much for buying equipment, but for training and education of doctors in palliative care, because palliative care is very English. Palliative care is very good. In fact, the hospice care, palliative care originated in England. They are palliative care meaning people who are dying. The word palliative care in Ukraine is a bit broader. It means people who cannot be cured, who are ill. But it's specifically, British palliative care is specifically helping people who are dying. And that's not just about giving them pain-killing drugs. It's about the whole, you might call it, spiritual package to make dying a less terrible experience. And believe it or not, you know, dying is never good, but it can be made much, much better than it is at the moment in many hospitals, particularly in Ukraine.
I apologize for this question, but that I would ask you. Your parents were involved in the human rights and were the part of the group of people who founded human rights organization Amnesty International. And later, you know, the scandal in Ukraine 2 years ago about the Amnesty International and they were the equality of the death of Russians invaders and the Ukrainian soldiers. But my question is, how should modern human rights organization act to find a balance between the good and evil? How they should act?
Well, it depends what aspect of human rights. I mean, Amnesty is a very different organization from the one it was when my parents founded it. Then it was only concerned with individual particular political prisoners. It then became this much, much bigger umbrella organization. And saying what it said about the war in Ukraine was profoundly stupid and rather out of their remit. It wasn't to do with political prisoners. Like my parents, if they were still alive, would have said, well, this is not what amnesty is about. I mean, it depends what aspect of human rights and activism you're dealing with. Ultimately, I think it has to do with it's a difficult question to answer, Elena. There's no simple answer.
Sorry.
To this. No, it's too complicated. I can't say what all human rights organizations should be doing. You need to talk to somebody like my friend Philip Sands, the human rights lawyer. He'll be in a better position to answer than me. I'm just a simple doctor.
Okay. And in the end, I wanted to ask you about that situation with your book publishing. At the beginning of the full-scale escalation, you completely banned the publication of your books in Russia.
In Russia,
yes. We all know that they have never respected copyright. And what about the pirated your books in Russia now?
Well, I can do nothing about it. It's my first book, before 10 years ago, was a very big bestseller in Russia, which I think is interesting. It suggests it sold well because Russia is not a society where people in charge, like a senior doctor, say, I make mistakes. Maybe that's why it sold well. So maybe it was good for Russians to read it. But when the war started and they wanted to publish my third book, I said, no, I want nothing to do with you. If they parrot it, well, I can do nothing about that. I'm helpless then. But I don't mind too much because the message of my books is all about self-criticism and the duty to be kind, which are lessons the Russians need to learn. So even if they read my parroted books, they will become better Russians.